Monotype.
Welcome to Creative Characters from Monotype, a show where we meet the people working at the intersection of type and everyday life. I'm Bill, and this is Carl, and we are your hosts. Hey, Carl.
Hey, Bill. How you doing?
I'm doing well. It feels like it's been a minute since we've done one of these together. It's kind of like a nice Friday tradition that I think I've missed recently.
I know. I think it's been a while since we've recorded an intro, and the last time it was still quite chilly out, and today it's like sunny and 80. Like summer is here.
We're back, baby.
We'll see if it sticks around. It's
the summer of creative characters. Let it commence.
Last Memorial Day, it was 46 degrees and pouring rain here in Massachusetts. So hopefully we don't have a return of that.
No, we're gonna have good vibes, and we have good vibes about today's episode too. I think we spent a lot of time talking about stylistically about design and more around that element of it. But there's so much form and function to design as well that often goes unnoticed. And I think today is a really wonderful episode about the power that design can have in just enabling everyday life. Do you want to tell everyone about today's guests?
Today's guests are Jennifer Sagalyn and JoAnn Becker from an organization called Perkins Access. Perkins Access is one of the leading accessibility consultants in the country, and they specialize in helping brands develop digital properties, websites, etc., and making sure that websites and other web content are compatible with screen readers and other technologies that help people with visual impairments and other disabilities. And Perkins is actually a local Boston organization that's affiliated with the Perkins School for the Blind. But more broadly, they really focus on bringing an attitude of inclusivity and access to branding in general and to how the way organizations are structured. So this episode is quite personal to me. My younger sister has cerebral palsy. She's been in a wheelchair her whole life. And so my family and I have spent those decades with her sort of confronting inaccessibility in a lot of different ways, from staircases and step-ups and missing curb cuts. And when you listen to JoAnn, who is blind herself, you realize that the digital world is full of the same kind of obstacles people encounter in the real world. So ultimately, this episode is really about the power of design to create a more equitable world, because as more of our day-to-day lives go online and happen in digital space, you have to be thinking about the full range of human experience. And so I think that's what Perkins is really focused on, is this attitude that accessible design is really human-centric design, and human-centric design and quote-unquote good design are not mutually exclusive. They're the same. And so for brands, thinking about, what if a person comes to our website using a screen reader? Are we prepared to give them a meaningful experience? Can they complete everything that anyone else would complete on our buyer journey or on our website? And, JoAnn tells some stories that are really quite shocking when you hear them, about how a simple oversight can create a huge disruption for someone who is using some sort of accessibility technology to interact with your website. So really a powerful episode, and the timing for this couldn't be more perfect. It's not a coincidence, but May 19th is Global Accessibility Awareness Day. You can learn more about that at accessibility.day. And, it's a day that's just dedicated to raising awareness around digital accessibility and creating a more equitable online world.
I think this is the kind of episode that once people hear some of the insights, from experts in the field and people who deal with this every day too, it hopefully will be impossible not to recognize it, in your day-to-day going forward, and hopefully just inspire a little bit more awareness and, for us, as you said, to build a more inclusive world. So no further ado, I will turn it back over to you, Carl, and to today's guests for this episode of Creative Characters. Please enjoy, everybody.
Hi, everybody. I'm Carl, and I'm really excited to be here today with JoAnn Becker and Jennifer Sagalyn from Perkins Access. Jennifer, JoAnn, welcome. How's it going?
Great. I'm delighted to be with you.
We'll get to this later, but we had a heck of a time getting this podcast set up, and it actually was sort of pertinent to the topic we're going to discuss. So maybe a good place to start is for both of you to sort of introduce yourselves a little bit, and maybe you should tell our audience what Perkins Access does. What's the organization all about?
So I am JoAnn Becker, and I'll tell you, inclusion and accessibility are really personal to me. I have been blind my entire life. And so when I think about the impact that it's had being blind, I've actually made decisions about my career based on the fact that I'm blind, and I know the importance of technology and accessibility. So I've worked with a variety of companies, the major access technology companies, and I've been in a variety of roles, doing everything from marketing, sales, training, user testing, and I've had the fortune of being able to work with students, teachers, users around the country. And I'm at Perkins now, and it's been a delight to see the difference it makes in the lives of students. And our mission is an important one. We are making the world more accessible for blind people and everyone in general.
My name is Jennifer Sagalyn. I am the Director of Strategic Partnerships for Perkins Access. I have been working in accessibility for most of my career. I started in the field of closed captioning and audio description, and I've been working at Perkins Access in our consulting division. We are part of the larger Perkins School for the Blind, and our professional consulting services are provided to organizations to bring both the perspective of native users of assistive technology together with experts in the field of accessibility to help organizations provide accessible products and services and be proactive about being accessible.
And you mentioned the Perkins School for the Blind. So we're all Boston centric here. And, the Perkins School is a pretty well-known institution, a pretty prominent presence in the city. But for people who are just not familiar with it, can you just give us a background on the school itself and the relationship between Perkins Access and the Perkins School for the Blind?
So I'm just going to mention that as JoAnn said, Perkins' mission is to prepare students for the world. And at Perkins Access, we see that we're preparing the world for our students and for people everywhere with disabilities by improving digital accessibility. JoAnn, do you want to talk a little bit about sort of the Perkins School for the Blind and the history?
Well, interestingly, it is the oldest school for the blind in the country, and people are familiar with Helen Keller, Annie Sullivan. They both attended Perkins, as did Laura Bridgman. So that may be a connection that people make with this institution.
So let's kind of get into some of the history here, because I think, obviously the Perkins School for the Blind has this history, and your organization is doing really great work with companies and organizations who want to, take inclusion, to a higher level. But that hasn't always been the case. Walk us through a little bit about how we've gotten to this point where, inclusion and consideration for people with, various visual or other disabilities has, how have we evolved to this point, even going back to before the ADA, and how that has changed sort of the national conversation around this topic?
Well, in terms of Perkins Access, interestingly, when I began working here 10 years ago, Perkins Access didn't exist. And I think what is really one of the concepts about Perkins that I like is it's looking proactively at ways in which we really can make the world a more accessible one. And so clearly there is a need not only for accessible media and digital content, but also to make people aware of the need that people have around the world. And I think Perkins Access began, how many years ago, Jennifer?
7 or 8.
So we are making real strides. And I think the more that I interact with people in the community, and I do a lot of training throughout the state, I see the relevance of the work we're doing, and it's making an impact because we're informing people about areas about accessibility that perhaps no one's ever thought about.
And you both mentioned that you've worked in this field, for the majority of your careers, right? So I'm curious, if you were to go back to the early days when you were just starting out and sort of compare and contrast where things were then and where things are now, how have things changed just in the span of your careers?
So looking back on the work I've done in accessibility, what I've seen is there's been a focus on the technology and ensuring that the technologies for accessing information are accessible and needed to be made accessible in order for us to get to a point where now you are able to use something like your iPhone and the built-in screen reader in the iOS operating system, and the content now is more of the focus in terms of the apps and the content for accessibility. I think, JoAnn, probably your experience with the iPhone and VoiceOver, I would love to hear you sort of talk about that, because I think, looking back on accessibility and where it was in the 90s was about the technology and building in that infrastructure. And that is still important today, but we're at a point now where those technologies exist, and so much of the digital world now, needs to focus on building in accessibility just into the process of design and development, so that there's, you have the technology and then you have the content that is accessible.
It is such a major difference. I think back to the days, and we're talking prior to iPhone accessibility, but I used to have a scanner, $1,000 software to actually scan material and read it aloud to me. OCR is what it's called, optical character recognition. I had devices to listen to books. I had a color recognizer. I had so many different gadgets, all of which, by the way, were expensive. And of course, I still do use a screen reader on my computer. But what has been fascinating is the fact that I can now go into an Apple store and, just like anybody cited, buy an iPhone. I could buy a Mac computer. I could buy an Apple Watch, all of which I happen to own. And it's built in accessibility. They have included a screen reader in the design of their product. So accessibility matters to Apple. And it didn't begin that way, by the way. When Apple was launching all of its MacBooks in Maine, what occurred was a major blow to blind students because they couldn't access the MacBooks. And so there was a lawsuit, and Apple took it very seriously. And they got it that they needed to change because blind students were going to be left, and we simply didn't have any other method for blind students to be able to access the material. So now Apple has really led the way. And you're right, Jennifer, the material, the content is so crucial. If you think about blind people, many blind people are under or unemployed. What do most blind people own? We happen to own iPhones because how crucial they are for our everyday use. And the apps that are accessible to us really change how we function in the world.
It sounds like both a hardware accessibility and then software accessibility, right? So it's, can you use the device, period, and then does the software have accessibility baked into it?
I think it's the software. It's also the content. So whether it's a website with images, for example, do the images have alt text? That's really a content issue. And so it might be on a mobile device, the app and the navigation of the app, but it also is the content within the app and the content within a website that, if you follow the practices for web accessibility, those are the ways that you make the content accessible.
Yeah.
A perfect example, and it's a funny, quirky example. I used to listen to Grammar Girl podcasts, and she came up with an app. And I thought, oh my gosh, that's going to be so fun. Grammar Pop. Downloaded it, could not access one single thing, not one. So there you have it. I mean, the content there, and it would have been fun, and I was so disappointed. But usually the apps on iPhones one of the things that distinguishes them is the designers know that they have to include accessibility as they're designing.
I'll share a bit of my story too here, because my slightly younger sister has cerebral palsy. So fine motor skills are a huge challenge for her. And we've you can sort of chart her age with the quality and usefulness of the various devices that were available to her, communication devices. And then, my God, we went through so many different talk boxes and iterations of those things. And then, the early software programs that were available to assist her, like early predictive text, where you start typing and it starts giving you words, but, they weren't the words you wanted. And you would, in some cases, have to type out 90% of the word to finally get it, to where now she has an iPad. And, and with some modifications to the interface there, she's able to use it. And so there's this trajectory, toward more integrated accessibility on devices that are mainstream.
And we're also seeing so many of the large technology companies that are starting to use AI for accessibility. So Microsoft and Google, there's really a commitment now to going beyond and really building and designing products to be inclusive for everyone. So I that's a change that I think we've seen over the past 5 to 10 years. And I'm hopeful the next 5 to 10 are really the, as we say that I'd like to be put out of a job, because it would be great to just have this be part of how everyone designs and develops their products and services.
So you mentioned Apple in particular making that switch to where now they seem very invested and they're taking this very seriously, and Microsoft and Google as well. Because at the end of the day, those are the people you need to partner up with, right? You need them to be like, this is important and we're going to invest in it because we're making the products people are buying. Are you able to kind of pinpoint where that flip happened and why? What sort of changed, or has it been more gradual?
Well, in the case of Apple, I do think that the lawsuit was certainly at which they realized they needed to make some changes. But what's interesting? Who would have ever thought a flat screen device would be something that a blind person would use? People that are sighted say to me, well, yeah, but it doesn't have any buttons on it. How in the world do you figure out what to do? And the brilliance of the design and the fact that we can enjoy that design just like anybody else is such a fun and fabulous thing. And I think with Microsoft, it's been interesting because there have been struggles along the way, and yet more recently, I'd say in the last 5 years, Microsoft has an accessibility desk that is available to people 24/7. And so if there's something going on with Windows or Office, it's possible to actually get assistance from Microsoft. Now, I think certainly blindness organizations have been in communication with these larger companies. And I also think companies are beginning to get it. Over 1 billion people have some kind of disability. And in the end, it's really good business. I, as well as so many people on the planet, own a Windows computer, use Microsoft Office 365. When you provide services that work for many, not a few, and your website and your products are actually useful and functional, it's going to draw and attract people, and businesses are going to do a lot better by attending to all people, not just a few.
So at the center of all this stuff is the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA. So I think our audience could probably benefit from a quick refresher on where did the ADA come from? When was it implemented, and why? And how has it evolved as, our world has gotten more complicated and digital?
I think many disabled people are beginning to see issues similar to those of civil rights. And so I don't know that blind people previously thought about blindness as a civil rights issue, but I know now that that is really a fundamental way in which to view issues of how we should perceive the world. And, it's an interesting question. Like, I do not think of myself as disabled. I think that I am blind, and yet I think what's disabling is the way the world is constructed around me. I mean, it's constructed to work well for sighted people, but it's not really designed to work if you can't see. But that's the issue. I mean, it's not that because I'm blind, I'm disabled. So I do make that distinction. And I think for a lot of people, it's beginning to become clear that people do need to have a voice and do need to have representation and do need to be seen. And so I think we're seeing more attention, and it's the right thing to do for companies and organizations to be aware of disabilities. But also, I think disabled people are beginning to understand the role that they play in making our situation known to others. So something like a podcast like this could perhaps be helpful in getting people to understand more about disabilities.
But that's a really good way to think about design. When you're designing a website, you're designing for a range of experiences, not a subset. And that's kind of how the environmental world is built. It's built for a subset of people, and then, on occasion adapted for other people.
It occurs to me that maybe people don't even know what a screen reader is. And just to briefly explain that, it's a software application that works really closely with the operating system on a computer. So it provides access to icons and folders and files and dialog boxes, all of those interactions, as well as web applications. And a screen reader uses text-to-speech, so it has synthetic speech that reads aloud. And it's really true. When you think about somebody sighted who looks at a web page, it just may seem like, well, what's the big deal? I mean, what's so difficult about a web page design? And yet, if you incorporate regulations that really do impact screen reader access, it can make such an enormous difference. Going to a new web page for the first time, I, for example, obviously don't use a mouse. I can't see the pointer, so I am a keyboard user. And so the whole experience of how I come to a new web page and explore a web page is different than if I were sighted and just looked at it and I would think, oh yeah, that's where that button is. Oh yeah, I click there and I do very different things. I have to get an assessment of the web page itself. I have to figure out, oh my gosh, okay, what kind of regions are on this page? Are there headings? Are there links? Are there buttons? I mean, all those kinds of things you don't think about if you're sighted, and yet for a screen reader user, it's crucial. It makes the difference between success and failure, something being functional and usable or not at all. And funny things like dialog boxes that don't initially read aloud by a screen reader that appear on a page can make the difference between success and not trying to access new information. So, it's a fascinating thing, because I'm sure I can't even imagine how it must be for a sighted person to look at a web page and just think, oh my gosh, oh yeah, that's where the button is, and just click on it. And just a very quick story. I was teaching a gentleman to order groceries online, and he was so proud of himself. He learned the check boxes and what he needed to do, and he went through all of his grocery list of what he wanted, and he was so happy he could actually hear what items were available. And so I said, okay, so you ready to check out? And he said, sure. And I said, B for button, you know what to do? Yeah, nothing. So I said, well, now wait, this is bizarre. So do a JAWS find and see if you can locate the word checkout. Nothing. So I have a driver that takes me to different people's locations around the state. So I asked him to come in, and I said, now, I think I'm losing my mind. This has to have a button, a checkout button. He said, yeah. Totally not labeled. I had no idea that it was even there. Fortunately, my driver clicks the mouse and completed the order. But it's those kinds of things that people don't even think about. And yet it's such a frustration when they're not accessible, and makes all the world of difference when they are.
Yeah, must be very frustrating. Can't even imagine. I imagine maybe part of what you do at Perkins is sort of helping people empathize with that experience and like get into the point of view of a person who's blind or has a visual impairment or some other obstacle to access, and really like walk them through that experience. What's your process of educating the organizations you work with on the needs of their customers?
One of the things that I just love that we're able to do is that we work with JoAnn, and she helps to evaluate whether we're working with someone who has a retail website or if it's for a healthcare organization. We are doing an evaluation of the experience for JoAnn going through a key use case, and what are the barriers that she's encountering, and we're able to document and really present that information to the designers and the developers of that experience, and talk through what, where those buttons, that have been encountered are not labeled, and what does that mean? Potentially, as JoAnn just described, the barrier to actually checking out. And that is very, very valuable. It gives us an opportunity to bring that perspective. And that's really, where we want to be an organization that isn't just about checking the box of meeting the standards, but we want to help bring in, this is about supporting your community, your users, your employees, and their experience.
To Jennifer's point, people can think, okay, well, you know what? I'm going to spend $19 a month and get this overlay that's going to make my website accessible. Well, I can tell you recently I've had all these weird experiences where I go to a website and it's for screen readers, press Alt+1 for access. It is so maddening because it's actually made some websites less accessible. And the other thing that I think people often believe is they can use a tool, an automated tool, and it's going to tell them. It may help them know some of the issues around accessibility, but I'll tell you, usability and a functional website are two very different things from just using an automated tool. You may think you've tackled all the problems, but until you actually have users who are there working with the website and experiencing some of the issues that perhaps need to be changed in the design, it makes such a difference to have a user base that's willing to test websites.
So are you describing a sort of like third-party plugin or intermediary that sort of connects the website to a screen reader? Yeah,
well, I think it sounds really good. Spend $19 a month and your website is accessible in this weird kind of way. I don't know, because my experiences with it have just not worked. So for me, it hasn't been a solution, but rather a problem. But it sounds good to somebody who just wants a quick fix. And I think if people really begin understanding, how do we get people to understand from the very onset of a project? Oh my gosh, I have to consider not just people who are sighted. We have to think about disabilities, a range of disabilities. It's like that's where it needs to begin.
Yeah.
And I do have to say, well, this is just something that I am just mind boggled about, that I'm so thrilled about. When Jennifer was mentioning audio description, well, that is something that, in my opinion, has been transformational. So Jennifer's been at this a while, but I can tell you, I never used to think that I cared about audio description. I thought, yeah, right, who cares? During the pandemic in particular, I don't know what I would have done without Netflix. It's done an amazing job. When I say amazing, I mean amazing. I watched The Queen's Gambit, and I will tell you, I felt as if I not only didn't miss anything, I had the thought, geez, I wonder if somebody sighted turned on audio description, if they'd even get more from it. It was just brilliant. the things that I've watched that have they've been done so wonderfully, beautifully, descriptively. I feel as if, unfortunately, I've become one of those people who binge watches television. But it's been such a wonderful thing to complain about. I'm now a binge watcher. Who would have thought that would happen? I watch the Winter Olympics. My favorite sport is, I know it sounds crazy, but figure skating. I just love the idea, the person doing this amazing thing by him or herself on the ice, and the music and the whole choreography. I just love the idea of it. And it was audio described this year for the first time ever.
Wow.
So I now know what triple sow cow and whatever, all those great, crazy descriptions. They did a great job of describing them. A double lux.
That's interesting. So that's basically having the action on the screen just described to you in, I assume, very vivid detail.
And beautifully done detail.
Yeah.
I mean, not irrelevant stuff, but stuff that really helped me understand, the expression on somebody's face. It's amazing how good audio description has become.
I'm so happy to hear that, JoAnn, having worked in that field for a while. And I will say that describers that create the scripts it's really an art. It is.
I mean, that must feel a bit like magic, to have that description coming at you and being able to, experience what's happening on the screen, whether it's a show or live sports or live event or something like that. It just must feel incredible.
Oh, exactly. And it's just one of those things that I am so grateful that people like Jennifer were thinking in the correct direction about how to make things accessible that I didn't think really mattered. And now I think, oh my gosh. I mean, I watched Ozark, for God's sake. Now that is a series that you wouldn't think would be accessible. Totally accessible. I mean, it's just crazy.
I bet it's a fun job, actually, doing that. Having to both write and then read, this text interpretation of what's happening in these wild shows. Like Ozark is a good example.
And the text is written in a way that it's inserted between the dialogue. So there's a limited amount of time that you have to create a certain amount of that description of the elements on the screen. And when you think about closed captioning, there's so many uses of closed captioning, so many audiences that benefit from closed captioning. The same with audio description. If you're not able to view the program, it is something you can use the audio description with the information, the soundtrack, to have the same experience. So we all get to benefit, JoAnn.
Yeah.
And we can all stay up to date with Ozark. Going back to your experience with the checkout, I'm curious, if you see kind of the same issues time and time again when companies come to you for consultation. What jump out at you as the most sort of common, I don't want to say mistakes, but maybe some of the most common gaps in digital accessibility when brands come to you for help?
Well, people often don't have headings on their web page, and headings make it so simple. So with my screen reader, I can just press the letter H and it moves from heading to heading, or I can even press the letter H1 or H2 depending on the level of the heading. And that makes it so much easier to move through text. And when it comes to form fields, having them labeled properly, and the buttons, I mean, if they're not labeled, they're just not accessible. So it's been interesting because I do still come across web pages frequently that don't have things labeled properly. And so it either means I can access something or can't. And, just before pandemic life, and I used to travel a lot, the date pickers with different airlines, I could do my very best. I could select everything except when it came to the date picker. So I would either be coming and leaving at the same time, at which point they would say, invalid input or some such thing. But I could never choose the date and the time. and it just they never worked. And it's such a simple thing, really, but if the people designing the web page don't understand that for a screen reader, it has to have certain characteristics, then the design keeps failing from the point of view of a screen reader access.
And that's a fairly essential component of booking an airline ticket, is choosing when you're going to fly.
You know what? I never could do it. I always had to call them up, and then they would say, we're going to charge you $25. And I would say, no, actually, I tried to use your website, but I couldn't. I happen to be blind, and this is what happened. And, it happened time and time. It was frustrating because then you have to wait forever online to speak to somebody. And I just wanted to quickly make the reservation myself, and I would have been done with it. So that's the other thing. It's just like, I want to be independent, and I don't want to have to rely on somebody else to do what I know I could do if things were designed properly.
Yeah. And it's a good example of how something so simple can have such an outside disruption to your life, because it's not just that it doesn't work on the website, but now you have to pick up the phone and you have to sit on hold for 2 hours while you wait for someone, to complete a task that, if done well, would take 10 seconds, maybe, so it's there's this ripple effect of disruption that starts from this very comparatively small but easily overlooked barrier. And then the cost to you as the user is very high to complete this task. I have to ask, because Monotype is a typography company, what are some elements of the text on websites and in the digital world that causes issues? I understand that live text is essential to being interpreted by screen readers, and text on images is not, and so that's not a good practice. But what are some areas where, besides the labeling and maybe the metadata, where other elements of website design can cause issues?
Well, for example, with video, often I don't know how to play the video because, again, there's no access to the play button, all of the controls that I would need to access. And in terms of images, the fact that people are now becoming more aware of alt text and how to just have a simple description. I mean, the fact that Facebook is using alt text now is pretty surprising. But again, people are becoming more aware of the needs of people with disabilities and blind people. So that does help. But that, for me, is, I think, secondary to just being able to efficiently work through documents and web pages. And if I have a goal in mind, being able to succeed in completing the task.
Sure.
I have a little story to share.
Oh, please do.
Related to text. And so, we think of color contrast and font size. Something that I think is sometimes not always considered is when someone is colorblind. And so I just had a conversation today telling me how much they love Wordle. And I said it took me a while to get on the bandwagon, but I really love Wordle. And they described how their husband is colorblind and not able to see the differentiation between the colors indicate, whether you have the right letter in the right place. And I said, and now I'm very curious to know whether someone using a screen reader can access Wordle. So JoAnn, not to put you on the spot, but
you know what? I haven't actually tried using it, but everybody's doing Wordle, so I'll have to try. Yeah.
And so what I was thinking is, I know that a large organization recently, acquired Wordle, and something that we really promote with organizations is that, as you're building or you're designing, there are best practices. Perkins Access has the Perkins Access Inclusive Design Guide. There's so much information that really is available for designers and for developers to follow, so that if you are going to build a Wordle, you are able to really look at these best practices and standards and gain a perspective that allows you to create inclusive experiences. The knowledge is out there, and it's something we're hoping, over time will just become part of what organizations believe is the right way to do business.
So JoAnn, you mentioned the pandemic turning you on to audio versions of television and stuff like that. So I'm wondering more broadly, have you both noticed a change in either focus on this as a result of the pandemic or during it, or possibly even like raising the stakes for companies who aren't digitally accessible? And we know that with so many people being stuck in their houses, a lot more of our day-to-day life went online, whether it was ordering groceries or things that you would do in real life, quote unquote, now you're doing at home. So I'm just wondering if this shared experience has shifted the urgency around accessibility at all.
I think it really has, simply because, as you point out, everything needed to be done online. And when that wasn't possible, I know when I tried ordering groceries and the pandemic first began, wow, it was a real challenge, significantly. And so I know I was using one of the grocery services, and I couldn't actually select the time for delivery. So finally, I did find somebody with a phone number that helped me figure out who to speak to. And they did fix the issue, but it took maybe a month. So yeah, there are definitely things that I think people's attention became, significantly changed when they realized we're doing everything online.
Yeah. I guess what I'm wondering, and I guess what maybe I'm hoping, is that this pandemic experience of ours has maybe started to shift things permanently a little bit. Maybe something we could call a paradigm shift in how present accessibility is in the minds of people, organizations, building new websites, deepening their digital ecosystem. Jennifer, you said you're hoping to be out of a job in 10 years.
I'm an optimist. So I'd like to say that there has been a change for the better, but we have such a long way to go. And JoAnn, I'd be interested to know, your experience. So I've been reading quite a bit about COVID tests, and that you need to be able to look at the results of the COVID test to know whether you have COVID or not. And so I'm interested, JoAnn, in your feeling about this question related to maybe some of the barriers that I see as continuing to be prevalent.
Right. Well, exactly. I'm optimistic as well, and I'm realistic. And I think much more education, much more discussion. And I think it's great when people begin to understand some of the limitations that are not our own, but just are like with COVID testing. There's no way I can do that test by myself. So fortunately, I have a good camera on my iPhone, and I can use a service and call somebody to have them assist me with it. But it would be nice if there had been thought about how could this person do the test without using sight.
Yeah. So then I wonder if maybe the optimism is around a mindset shift where we're not going to settle, right? We're going to say whoops, this doesn't work. So how do we fix it? Instead of just being like, too bad. Right?
Exactly.
So not to put you on the spot, but do you feel like we're heading in that direction? Heading toward a more problem-solving mindset?
Well, if it's not there, we're going to nudge people in that direction. That's for sure.
That's right. We're heading there. And I think accessibility, is something I'm starting to see as part of DEI initiatives. The DEI is now IDEA, and the A is, the accessibility. And it really is part of that conversation. And that is a positive sign.
Well, that's a really good point. And one thing, Jennifer, you and I talked about, several weeks ago or months ago at this point when we first met, was that, at Perkins, you don't just focus on the digital part of the business, right? Because there's this whole other side of it, which is like the actual human side, and how companies can actually make, their day-to-day operations in-house more accommodating for people of all situations. So are you getting, is there more of a focus on that these days as well?
Definitely. We are hearing from organizations that they're starting to recognize that there's their products and services they're creating for their customers. Maybe they have had legal action and that brought it to their attention. And now they're asking about the software and the content they're providing for their employees. And that is a shift that we're starting to see. And it's a great opportunity for organizations to really think about how they're bringing on people to work within their organization that can help bring this perspective. So having a broad range of employees with varying abilities and perspectives gives an organization that context. And so that's also, something we're hoping to see more of in the future.
How about you, JoAnn?
Jennifer said it beautifully.
This might be a tough one, but I'm going to put it to you anyway and see what you think. So the question I have as it's written is, what does a truly accessible world look like? And where would you love to see this conversation in 5, 10, or 15 years from now?
It's a big question. It's a very big question. When I think about where I'd like to see things in 5 to 10 years, the conversations that I would like to be having with organizations in the accessibility space, it really is about the phrase shift left has been used for many years to think about where you think about bringing accessibility into your process. And I really believe that if we are able to get the shift left to go as far left as possible, and be when we start just having an idea of our product, of our service, of the way that we are engaging with potential employees, when we are really in that creation stage, and the way that we go about that creation is thinking of, and not just of someone who has a visual impairment, but of all of the different perspectives and experiences that people will have. How do you bring that into the product creation process? And that is something organizations are working on, but it's still so early. It isn't something that just is happening naturally. And I think that we are hearing that the idea of inclusion and product inclusion is really gaining traction. But I would like to see in 5 to 10 years that companies are competing against one another to be more inclusive. That will be a wonderful day.
I love the sound of that. It's the idea of, the accessibility part of things is just there on day one, and it's not really like a separate consideration. It's there on day one, and it's how are we going to do this? You could liken it to, the wheelchair ramp is baked into the architectural design. It's not tacked on 6 months after the building's finished, around the back of the building or something like that. It's, it's just part of the design. It's a given, and, not an adaptation. It's part of, the thing itself, and it's, it's part of the beauty of whatever you're building.
Exactly.
That would be great.
Curb cuts are a great example of inclusive design, and ideally the future holds digital curb cuts everywhere we turn.
Yeah, it's a really good way of putting it. Well, Jennifer, JoAnn, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a wonderful conversation, and I have to say, I think the work you guys are doing is amazing and essential, and I'm just glad you found some time to talk with me today. So thanks for joining us on the podcast, and I hope the rest of your evening is wonderful.
Such a pleasure. Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you so much, you guys. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening. If you want to learn more about JoAnn and Jennifer and the work they're doing at Perkins, visit their site at perkinsaccess.org. Also, look for a link to our blog post in the show notes of this episode, and check out monotype.com/podcast to read about all of our prior guests. If you've been enjoying the podcast, please go to Apple Podcasts or Spotify to rate and review this episode. And if you really like us, subscribe to the show and share us with your friends. Creative Characters is a production of Monotype, Christopher Sound, and Marie Tabarez. We will be back with more episodes soon. Take care, everybody.